Sunday school. Dr. Sherritt is unavailable today, so I will be filling in for him. If you're watching on Facebook and would like to share a prayer request, go ahead and do so in the comments section below, and we will pray at the end of this lesson. Keep in mind it's obviously public and everyone can see it, so whatever discretion you want to show in that regard, go ahead and show. But we're happy to know what's going on in your life and pray for you, and we welcome you here. Today we're going to talk about one of the characters in the stories of Jesus' life that I feel like gets not as much of we got the slide up. Not as much press. Now he gets not as much press because for a couple different reasons. We know so little about him. And like within the function of the story, we may say, well, what exactly does he do? Why is he here? Is he just kind of tagging along? What's his purpose in all this? And the thing about that, we may sort of marginalize him or not think about him as much, but anytime you look at a manger scene like that, or like the one there, or the one out front that almost blew into Clinton County on Friday night, Joseph is right there. And if you're like me, you've probably not thought as deeply about what it means within Jesus' birth that Joseph is present as maybe definitely not Mary or the angels or even the shepherds and the wise men, but Joseph is there and he plays a prominent role. How prominent of a role does he play? If you look at the four Gospels about Jesus' life, there is two of them that do not talk about Jesus' birth at all. John and Mark. They just start with Jesus as a grown man, getting baptized and beginning his ministry. Now, one of the reasons for that is that writing was expensive back then. You know, I can take $2 and I can go into Dollar Tree and I can get like 3 pens like this and a big notebook, and I can write anything I want to write for $2, which is not a lot of money in today's economy. But back then, because the way that paper was made, it was expensive. And so as you're writing anything, you think, all right, what am I going to include and what am I going to not include? Just because I know this is a precious resource that I'm using. And a lot of Jesus' early followers were poor, so it's not like they can spend a ton of money writing everything there is to write. So only two of them talk about Jesus' birth. One is Luke, and it has 2 chapters that talk about Jesus' birth. And that's including, if you include like the angel coming to Zechariah, the angel coming to Mary. If you talk about the Charlie Brown verses, you know what I'm talking about? That Linus says at the Charlie Brown Christmas, we're talking 18, 19, 20 verses. All right, so not a lot of space. The book of Matthew devotes something like, working from memory here, 48 verses to the birth of Jesus, and the primary focus of those is Joseph. What does Joseph do when Mary comes to him and says, I'm going to have a baby? An angel of the Lord came to me. What does he do? How does he respond? When the wise men come and there's Herod, a rival king, is endangers him, how are we going to handle it? So, if there is this condensed space in these Gospels, we understand that it can't cover everything. And so if it can't cover everything and they're choosing what to include and what not to include, we have to think about what is the purpose of why they are writing these things, and why is this included and why is this not included. There's a couple verses that speak to this. Luke 1, 3, and 4 says, it's sort of the prologue, it said, "It seemed good also to me, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught." So he's writing it to this, Luke is writing a gospel that's basically to this, most people think it's an individual named Theophilus, and who's been taught things about Jesus, and Luke is writing an orderly account to confirm it. In the Gospel of John, at the end, in verses 20, chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, John is open. I'm like, I didn't tell you guys everything. He says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe in Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So he says, I'm writing, not everything's included, only that which will help you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. In chapter 21, verse 25, it says how much Jesus did. He said, "Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them written, I suppose that the world itself would not contain the books that would be written." So like we know, we're looking through like a crack into Jesus' life to know what we need to know about who he is. And so with that under consideration, that we know anything about Joseph is maybe kind of surprising. But because we've been told about him, that means he has an important function within the life of Jesus. Here's what we know about him. He wasn't Jesus' biological father. By the time that Jesus began his public ministry, it appeared that Joseph had passed away, and Joseph played a role in protecting Jesus from Herod. There was a second dream that he had, and he said, "You need to get out of here." So acting upon that dream, they fled to Egypt. And so we know that he was a carpenter. He had more children with Mary, 4 sons and 2 sisters. And his genealogy is mentioned. So, given the scarcity of space, the fact that half of what the entire Gospel of Matthew writes about the birth and infancy of Jesus is this genealogy. And in Luke, there's like 17 verses devoted to Jesus' genealogy. Now, let me ask you, knowing that the Bible is full of genealogies, what's your reaction when you read them? What do you think when you're reading a genealogy in the Bible? One of them is, honestly, especially in the Old Testament, I just kind of skim over. I'm like, I don't know what this is. Part of it is I think of it like I think of my own genealogy. All right? I'm trying to think. Micah at 13-year-old knows a lot more about our family history than I do. But there is I think it's either my great-grandfather or my great-grandfather. His name is Harvey Smith. And he knows that I don't. But what does that, I never met Harvey. So what does that fact really mean to our everyday lives now? Nothing, right? So the question becomes, when we talk about, here's the deal. when we talk about what is Joseph's function within the story about Jesus, there are several. One is God wanted Jesus to have an earthly father. His fathers are important. The second is, and we'll talk about this some in the worship service, is there's a foreshadowing of adoption. Joseph adopted Jesus. And throughout the epistles, Paul talks about God adopting our sons. But I would say that those are secondary to this. That the author, especially of Matthew, wanted to demonstrate that Jesus was a descendant of Abraham and a descendant of King David. Now, the reason that is important is as follows. God keeps his promises. And so, back in Genesis 22:18, he makes this incredible promise to Abraham. I think it's important to think about when he made this promise to Abraham. Abraham had just had his son Isaac in his old age, and God says, I want you to take him up on the mountain, I want you to pile him on top of some sticks, and I want you to do what? I want you to offer him to me as a sacrifice. And then presumably he would be burned up on the pile of wood. And Abraham is obedient, and as he's raising it up to strike his son Isaac, who he had waited decades for, an angel tells him to stop. And God says to him, because you have done this, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, as in the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gates of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you've obeyed my voice. And so the genealogy in Matthew goes from Abraham to David, from David to the deportation of Babylon, from the deportation of Babylon to Joseph to Jesus. And so it starts with Abraham, and you start to say, well, if Matthew is telling us about that Jesus is descended from Abraham, and there's this great promise that someday through Abraham's offspring, all people will be blessed, you begin to think, well, maybe this person that this book is about is that person that is going to bless the entire world. Abraham's offspring. And you start to raise the question, does this fulfill that promise? And so the next person that it talks about is going from Abraham to King David. And in 2 Samuel 7:13, David asks God, can I build a temple for you in Jerusalem? So from the time they left Egypt to the time that David was king and it sort of unified the kingdom, was the golden age, God's chosen one. The place of worship had been a tabernacle, a tent. An impressive tent, but a tent nonetheless. And David says, I want to build a permanent structure to be this place of worship, your home here on earth. And God says, no, you can't do it because you have been involved in bloodshed. But he says, he promises that through his son, he, and this is talking about Solomon, shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And so you begin to think about these promises God has made. Abraham, through your offspring, all nations will be blessed. Through David, there are in David's house, there will be, at some point, there will be an everlasting kingdom. Now, when Jesus was born, there hadn't been a king, a Davidic king on the throne in Israel for a long, long time. So you're thinking maybe all these things are starting to come true. The generations, if you will look at Matthew chapter 1, the generations from Abraham to David are listed as 14. From David to the deportation, 14. From deportation to Joseph, how many do you think? 14. So if you're like me, you wonder, what's the deal with 14, right? And I'm gonna, so what I'm about to tell you comes from several commentaries that I trust, because if I say it out loud, it sounds like I've lost my mind, all right? So every Hebrew letter has a corresponding number. In David's, I was telling someone the other day, I took 2 Hebrew classes my senior year in college. And on Friday, I was supposed to take a quiz to do the Hebrew alphabet, and I was struggling, and I said, I'm going to go drop the class. I don't need it, right? So my understanding of Hebrew is limited to about 1 hour and 40 minutes of professional instruction, all right? Which happened 19 years ago. So about Hebrew, I know what? Nothing, all right? So from what the experts say, though, that there's David, the first letter of his name, 4th letter of the alphabet, so we have what? 4. Second letter is a 6th letter, so we have 6. 4 plus 6 is what? 10. First and last letter, 14, all right? So the number 14 you would associate with the name of David. And so you're thinking that as you're reading this, it's important to read the Bible as the first people who read it, all right? The question we're asking is not what does this mean to me, because to find that, we have to first ask, what did that mean to the first person who read it? And what truth can I transport to me? How does that truth translate to my life? And here's why that's important. Because if you would slap up the genealogies from Luke and Matthew next to each other, they don't match. They don't match. Now they're different in that Luke goes from Jesus all the way back to Adam, who is the Son of God, and Matthew goes different, but they diverge at certain points. The book of Matthew traces the royal line of Solomon to Jesus, and the book of Luke takes the line of Nathan, David's son, to Jesus. And we're going to talk about, listen, this gets, the reason that I want to bring this up, because if you want to talk to someone about, who Jesus is, what it means to follow him, to believe in him, and for him to forgive your sins, a majority of people don't want to, right? I mean, Jesus himself said, narrow is the way and few people will find it. I have people in my life, and I would guess that probably you two do too, that if you would inject them with truth serum and said, why do you not believe in Jesus and become a Christian? It's because, truthfully, they do not want to yield their lives to him. If I confess that Jesus is Lord and that I should follow his lead in my life, then that means I'm going to have to stop doing X, Y, and Z, and I don't want to do that. That's straight up hard-heartedness. But most people will not say, when addressed. Like, they will not say, hey, why aren't you a Christian? They will not say, well, because I'm hard-hearted and I want to do what I want to do and not be what Jesus wants me to do. Most people won't say that, right? But they'll say, well, I have to find some reason that Christianity doesn't make sense and find some objection to it. And so one of the things they do is they say, well, the Bible contradicts itself. How can it be true if the Bible contradicts itself? And one of the things that they'll do, you can find this on the internet, you look at Jesus' genealogies, they don't even match. We can go back to the last slide. They diverge at a certain point. And then it says Joseph, it has Joseph, Jesus, his father, has two different dads. One is Heli. I meant to look up the pronunciation of that. And the other is Jacob. Can Jacob and Heli both be Joseph's dad? And to us, we see the answer to that is what? No, that can't be true. So either Luke or Matthew must be wrong. Both things can't be true. The Bible contradicts itself. How can I trust it for anything else in my life? Now, we know, like, one of the bedrocks of our faith is that the Bible is reliable. So there must be some other explanation. And so how do we go about understanding this? And that's why I said it's important to understand that it was written to a certain group of people in a certain place and time, and how they understood it would make a tremendous amount of difference. Like, if they read the book of Matthew, its genealogy, and they say, you know what, I see what you're doing there. What you're trying to demonstrate is a couple different things. You're demonstrating every 14 generations, something big happens. You made a promise to Abraham, then David comes. David comes, and then we get shipped off to Babylon. It's big, but it's not good. And then 14 generations, Jesus comes. It signifies something big. God is acting in a big way in the world through Jesus. Now, if you skip a generation, they don't think about that like we would think about that. If I said, Harvey Smith is my father, you'd say what? No, he's not. No, he's not. We know your dad. He visits here. Some of you may even know his name is Dale, not Harvey. But we use the word father in a particular way. There's 5 different ways that they would have used the word father. One is your offspring. Another one is someone who is your ancestor. One would be in the Bible they refer to your stepfather. Life expectancy was way shorter back then, and so people were dying all the time, and they were having stepfathers who functioned as their fathers. The other was this thing called it's called a kinsman redeemer relationship, which I think we'll have time to talk about in a minute, I think. And then there's a 5th one. It's on my notes here. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But so they meant a lot of different things when they said father, and so they didn't take it as literally as we might. Oh, son-in-law was the 5th one. Some of you still call. Some people call their in-laws mom and dad, which is, I don't know, it's an interesting thing, but in a closer, more familial situation, that would have mattered. So, what are we to make of the differences here? Because with the genealogies, we get a couple things. One, God keeps his promises. The reason he is tracing Matthew, he says that he is the son of Abraham and the son of David. This number 14 has to do with who? David. Because God had made this promise that one day a son of David would be on the throne. So what he's demonstrating is in Matthew is that God keeps his promises, and that this descendant of David, by adoption, is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. If God promises something, it's going to happen. Now, how does he go about that? It's a little bit complicated. So could we get back up the slide with Joseph's two situations? So here are the different possibilities, and we don't know which one is true and which one is not. The one with Joseph, son of Heli, and son of Jacob. I think it may be the next one. There we go. So how do we go about explaining that? And the second part of this is like, we want to be able to explain, if someone comes to us and says there's a contradiction here, how do we explain that? And there are several possible explanations that all would have made sense in the first century people who originally read it. Heli is Mary's dad, but one of the things you'll notice in Luke's genealogy is there's no women mentioned. And then Jacob is actually Joseph's dad. So in Luke, you have Mary's lineage, which was Davidic, which, by the way, biologically, Jesus wasn't Joseph's son. But because he adopted him, he was the legal heir to the throne of David. So he could make the legal claim. But then he had to actually be David's offspring to sit on the throne. He had to be Joseph's son, and he had to be of Davidic blood. And so you get both those things. If Heli was Mary's dad in the genealogy, and Jacob is Joseph's dad. Another possibility, I was drawing pictures last night and making notes about my notes to try to keep this all straight. Joseph's mother was married twice. Once, and to understand that you have to understand that there is this practice they had of preserving resources within a family. The idea is redemption. And so it can be something as a field. So let's say Ryan's family has a family farm. Does anyone in your family, cousins or anything, farm? No farmers? Dad's cousin. So say his dad's cousin falls upon hard times and has to sell the family farm. Now, when property leaves a family in the Old Testament, it's a bad thing. And so they made this provision where, like, all right, the closest related family member who has the money is going to buy the farm. And so let's say your dad's cousin has the family farm, but Ryan is the only one with enough money to buy that farm, right? We're going with that. Fictitious, all right? And Ryan says, you know what? The law says that if I have the resources to buy that family farm, then I can buy the family farm, and you're legally bound to sell it to me. Every 50 years, the property reset anyway, on the year of Jubilee. So go back to the original family that owned it. And so that we'll say that he redeemed it by keeping it within his family. There's another function of being a redeemer. It'd be something like this. Every male needed an heir, all right, a male heir. And this is where it gets a little bit foreign to us, a little bit weird if you think about it at your next family gathering. So let's say I am alive, I'm married to Jamie, but before we have children, I die in some sort of tragic accident, and I leave no male heir. The law of Moses says that can't happen. So, the next brother in line has to marry my wife. Again, this is weird. Don't think about this too hard at your next family reunion, all right? And hopefully produce a son, which would be his biologically, but legally would be whose? Mine. I know, it's confusing. It's weird to think about. So the idea is no man can die without a male heir. And so it doesn't matter who the biological father is if, according to how things are passing along, it matters who the legal father is. So if one of my brothers had a male heir with my wife, it would be considered my child and in my line. It's weird, isn't it? All right? But it's one of the ways you can say, well, how do we get around and comprehend these things? One is that, let me check my notes here, that Joseph's legal father, his mother's first husband who died before he was born, is Heli. Then his biological father would be Jacob. The third option is Heli is Mary's dad, but he has no biological son, so he legally adopts Joseph, which meant that Heli and Jacob were brothers or half-brothers, which would make Mary and Joseph, I'm trying to think, would that be cousins? I think. I'm trying to think. Like, I was drawing out pictures, but, like, again, they think about things entirely differently than we do now. But that's one way to think about this thing. So one way or another, Joseph was the heir to the throne, and by adopting Jesus, Jesus had a legal claim to the throne of David. And if Luke is of Mary's line, he's showing that he's a descendant of David, so he fulfilled that requirement, which I got a couple things from studying this. I know that this is somewhat obscure, but it demonstrates to me, at least, the extent to which God is willing to go to keep his promises to us. Like if he says, I am going to give David an everlasting kingdom, no matter how far afield and how weird the circumstances are that it came to be, when God says it, it's going to happen. God does not break his promises. So I take that truth about God and I think, well, what are all the promises that God made to me? And I hold them, and hey, we live in a time where people break their word and their promises all the time. But I look at all the things God has promised to me, and we know that God is going to keep his promises. He is going to keep them no matter what. It also shows in this strange kinsman-redeemer practice, where like brothers are marrying their sisters-in-laws. That all seems very strange to us, right? And a lot of that has to do with our idea of what relationships are. There are other parts of the world where marriages are arranged, right? And you think, oh, arranged marriage, that must be a disaster, right? When parents are arranging their marriage, How good can that be? Now let me ask you, who could do a better job of picking out my children's spouses, me or them? For real, who could? Someone that's never been married or someone that's been married for 18 years, 18 and a half years? Who could do a better job? Parents could, right? So it's all weird. So the idea of like, hey, there's this, you would marry someone out of an obligation to your older brother seems very weird to us. I mean, strange, but at the core of it, what it is like, God does not leave people behind. He's not going to leave them out in the cold. He cares about all people, no matter what. And if he cares about all people, and if his Old Testament law has some strange thing to make sure that everyone gets taken care of, then when I am concerned about things in my life, I know that God's going to take care of me too. If he's willing to put some kind of strange practice into place where everyone gets taken care of, he'll take care of me as well. Do we have any, we're about out of time. Do we have any questions about anything? There's lots of things I didn't get to. The important thing is God keeps his promises. In the genealogies, you see that something big is happening in the birth of Jesus. And one of the most important things is that Joseph, among the other contributions he has to Jesus' life, was a descendant of David. And so when Jesus says that is treated as a king and is proclaimed to be king, he has the rightful claim to that throne. The other thing would be like, the last thing is, when I think about who Jesus is, especially on his birth, do I take him for who everyone then said he was? The wise men, Herod, the angels all said, he is going to be the king. And because he's the king, whatever he tells me to do in my life, I should do. And because he is a benevolent, loving king, if I do what he's called me to do, my life will be a whole lot better than if I just do what I want. All right, were there any prayer requests that were mentioned, Jerry? All right, let's close in prayer then. Dear God, we thank you so much for today and how much you love us. I thank you that your word is true and that we can trust it. I thank you that you keep your promises to your people then, and that you keep them to us now. And I pray that we have the faith to rely on those things. We thank you that you do not leave anyone out in the cold, but you make sure that everyone's taken care of. And so I pray that when we have anxiety, that we will trust in you. Help us to know that as your children, that we can help those who are struggling as well. We thank you for your son. It's his name we pray. Amen.